Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The evening felt calm, almost too calm, as Sarah stepped inside her house after a long day at work. The weight of the day seemed to fall off her shoulders the moment she closed the door behind her. It was as though the world outside had faded away, leaving only the comforting silence of her home. The faint scent of lavender filled the air, mingling with the warmth of the house, creating a feeling of serenity. She took a slow breath, letting the familiar smell of lavender and the soft warmth of the room wash over her. It was a scent she had placed in the corners of her home months ago, a small indulgence that had come to represent peace, safety. After hours of noise and bustle at work, it was a relief to come home to something so still, so soothing. The rain outside tapped gently against the window, like a quiet rhythm that seemed to mirror her own thoughts. It wasn't a heavy storm, but a soft, steady drizzle, almost like nature itself was humbling the world outside. The sound of the rain created a peaceful ambience, and Sarah couldn't help but close her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the storm lull her into a kind of calm. There was no thunder, no harsh winds, just the steady hum of raindrops tapping against the window panes. It felt safe. The world outside seemed so distant, as if it had been muted by the curtains of rain. The occasional gust of wind would rustle the branches of the trees in the yard, but it didn't feel threatening. Everything, for the moment, felt quiet and still. Sarah opened her eyes again and glanced toward the window. The lights of the street lamps blurred through the glass, casting a faint glow over the darkened yard. The rain continued its gentle tapping, steady and unwavering, as though it had been doing this for hours. Sarah felt her shoulders drop, the tension in her muscles easing with each passing second. She took another deep breath, savoring the tranquility that surrounded her. It was exactly what she needed after such a long, draining day. As she stood there, taking it all in, she noticed something that made her pause. The silence in the room seemed thicker now. It wasn't that the house had suddenly become noisy, but rather that the quiet had taken on a strange, almost oppressive weight. She could hear the soft murmur of the rain outside, but there was something else. A kind of stillness that was more than just the absence of sound. It felt deliberate, as if something was waiting in the quiet. Sarah shook the thought away, mentally chiding herself for being so jumpy. She was just tired, that's all. But even as she told herself this, the uneasy feeling lingered. The house, for all its familiarity, felt different tonight, as though it were holding its breath. There was a strange kind of tension in the air, something that made her feel like she wasn't alone, even though she knew she was. She moved toward the kitchen, hoping to shake off the feeling. The act of preparing dinner, the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables, would surely settle her nerves. But the strange sensation didn't go away. The rain outside, once comforting, now seemed to press in on her, its rhythmic tapping growing almost too deliberate. It was as though the world outside was trying to get her attention. But why? Sarah stopped for a moment, knife still in hand, her mind drifting. The soft, regular tapping of the rain against the window seemed to echo in her ears, louder now, as if the house itself had grown quieter to highlight that sound. There was something about it that didn't sit right with her, something in the pattern, the consistency of it. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand, moving toward the stove and setting the vegetables into the pan. But still, the feeling of unease lingered. The air around her felt thicker, heavier, and she couldn't shake the strange thought that the house was watching her. As though, in this moment, the walls weren't just surrounding her, but aware of her presence. The tapping continued. Steady, rhythmic, almost purposeful. The thought grew stronger in Sarah's mind. It was as though the house had somehow changed, as if it was holding something back, waiting for her to notice. The rain, once a calming presence, now felt suffocating. The quiet was no longer peaceful, it was filled with something that made her skin prickle. The tapping of the rain grew louder in her ears, and she found herself straining to listen, almost hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It went on, each tap seemingly more deliberate than the last. Sarah wiped her hands on a towel, her thoughts becoming scattered. The house had always been so familiar, so welcoming. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was different tonight. That something had changed. Something was wrong. The tapping at the window was no longer soothing. It had become ominous. Her heart began to beat a little faster, though she couldn't quite say why. The silence and the rest of the house seemed to press in on her, intensifying the sound of the rain, the steady tap, tap, tapping. It was as though the house had become a part of the storm outside, just waiting, listening, for something to break the quiet. She turned away from the stove, trying to ignore the cold feeling creeping down her spine. The room felt colder now, the warmth she had felt earlier retreating, as though it too had sensed the change in the air. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination. It had to be. But the strange sense of being watched, of being listened to, persisted. It was as though the house itself had become alive, aware of her every movement. And still, the rain kept tapping, like a quiet insistence that wouldn't let her go. As Sarah stepped inside her home, she let out a long, slow breath, the weight of the day seeming to lift with each passing second. Her feet sank into the soft carpet as she kicked off her shoes, the comforting sensation of home wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. The quiet of the house welcomed her, a contrast to the noise and chaos of the world she had just left behind. The living room was exactly as she remembered it. Nothing had changed. The same worn couch sat against the far wall, its cushions sagging just a little in the center, a testament to years of use. It was a piece of furniture she had grown so accustomed to, its fabric soft from the many evenings spent curled up on it, reading or watching television. The lamp beside it cast a warm, golden glow, filling the room with a soft light that was both soothing and familiar. Sarah paused for a moment, taking in the room. The walls were painted in a pale cream color, simple and unobtrusive. The bookshelves were filled with all her favorite novels, each one a reminder of the quiet evenings she had spent reading, losing herself in stories that took her far away from the world. The photos on the walls, framed memories of family and friends, stood as a testament to the life she had built here. It was all so comforting, so familiar. For a moment, she let herself sink into the stillness of the room. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. It was just her in the quiet, the kind of silence that felt full and complete. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the calm, the warmth of the room enveloping her like a hug. She felt safe here. But as she stood there, the silence seemed to stretch on longer than usual, like the house was holding its breath. She opened her eyes, glancing around the room once again. Everything was exactly where it should be, nothing out of place, nothing strange. And yet, there was something about the stillness that felt a little too still. Her footsteps were muffled on the carpet as she made her way further into the room, but even that soft sound seemed to echo just a little too loudly in the quiet. It was as if the house itself was absorbing every movement, every sound. The air felt thick, almost heavier than usual. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, little sounds that would usually fade into the background of her awareness, but now they stood out, sharp and unnervingly clear. She moved to the window, pulling aside the sheer curtain to glance outside. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, the world outside bathed in a soft, gray light. The street lamps flickered faintly in the distance, their light pooling onto the wet pavement like small puddles of gold. The world beyond her home seemed distant, far away. And yet, the stillness of the house made her feel more connected to it than ever before. It was almost as though the house had become a part of her, its silence now a reflection of her own inner quiet. And yet, there was something unsettling about that. The air felt too still, the space around her too untouched, too perfect. She had lived here for years, but tonight, something about the place felt different, like she had never really seen it before. Sarah turned away from the window, her gaze falling on the old armchair by the fireplace. The plush seat seemed to beckon to her, inviting her to sit and relax. But as she walked toward it, she felt an inexplicable hesitation in her steps, a small hesitation that she couldn't explain. She had sat in that chair 1,000 times before, but tonight it seemed somehow foreign. The warmth from the lamp beside her filled the space, yet it didn't quite reach the corner of the room where the armchair sat, leaving it in shadow. A strange sense of unease settled over her as she looked at it, the shadows of the room seeming to stretch and sway in a way that didn't feel natural. Shaking the feeling off, Sarah reached down to pull the throw blanket from the back of the chair, preparing to settle in for a quiet evening. But as her fingers brushed the fabric, she froze. For a brief, inexplicable moment, it felt as though someone had just left the chair. The warmth of the cushion beneath her fingers lingered, as though it had been recently occupied. But she was alone. With a slight frown, she pulled the blanket up and draped it across the chair, trying to push the strange feeling aside. It was probably just her imagination running wild, she told herself. The house was simply old, and the air in the room had grown warmer from the rain outside. That's all. She moved to the kitchen, hoping the rhythm of preparing a meal would clear her mind. As she passed by the hallway leading to the stairs, she glanced at the framed photo of her family on the wall, the faces of her loved ones smiling back at her. The sense of normalcy was reassuring, but it didn't seem to reach her in the same way it usually did. There was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. She went into the kitchen and opened the cabinet to take out a pot, the sound of the doors creaking in the silence of the house almost too loud, too noticeable. As she set it on the stove, the ticking of the clock in the living room seemed to reverberate through the walls, stretching into the space around her. For a moment, Sarah stood still, eyes scanning the room, heart beating just a little faster than usual. The light in the kitchen flickered, just for a second, before returning to its steady glow. A subtle thing, easily dismissed. But it made her pause. She shook her head again, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease creeping through her thoughts. It's just the house, she told herself. Just the quiet after a long day. But even as she whispered that to herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She glanced over at the door leading into the dining room, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing there. But no one was there. The room, like the rest of the house, remained as it always had. And yet, Sarah couldn't rid herself of the feeling that the house was watching her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly moved back into the living room, trying to push the sense of discomfort away. She took a seat on the couch, its cushion sinking beneath her weight. As she sank into the familiar softness, she realized how much she was yearning for the comfort of this place. But something told her it wasn't just the physical comfort she was searching for. She wanted the peace she had always found here, the peace that seemed to be slipping away tonight. The stillness lingered. It wasn't comforting anymore. It was heavy, pregnant with something she couldn't identify. The room seemed to press in on her, its silence too perfect, too unbroken. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it, the subtle, unshakable awareness that something had changed. The house was the same, but somehow it was different. And that feeling, that nagging sense that she wasn't truly alone, made the air feel colder, the shadows in the corners of the room just a little deeper than before. The house was always peaceful. It was the kind of peace Sarah had come to rely on after long, tiring days. It was the kind of stillness that made her feel safe, cocooned from the noise of the outside world. But tonight, something felt different. The usual calmness of the space was there, but it felt off, like a quiet that wasn't entirely natural. The silence in the air seemed to stretch in a way she hadn't noticed before, and it felt too deep, too complete. It wasn't the usual gentle quiet that welcomed her after a busy day. It felt like the silence had been waiting, suspended in time, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Sarah paused in the middle of the living room, her senses on high alert. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague sensation. But it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The usual hum of her home, the soft creak of the floorboards, the distant tick of the clock, seemed to fade into the background. The silence hung in the air like a weight. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar room, looking for something, anything, that might explain the sudden change in atmosphere. But everything was exactly where it should be. The furniture was just as she left it. The pictures on the walls were still hanging straight. And yet, there was a subtle unease that she couldn't shake, a growing sense that something was off. Her breathing slowed as she tried to tell herself it was just the stillness of the night, the calm that naturally descended after the rain. But it didn't feel like that. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a restful evening. It was a silence that felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. Something watching her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed a little deeper tonight, more defined. Sarah couldn't help but glance at them, as if expecting something to move. But nothing did. Still, her eyes lingered there a little longer than usual, and she felt a quick, inexplicable chill crawl up her spine. It was as if the room had become too still, like the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She shook her head, trying to push the thought from her mind. There was no reason to feel this way. It was just her imagination, her tired mind playing tricks on her after a long day. The house had always been a place of comfort for her. There was nothing here to fear. And yet, the longer she stayed, the more intense the feeling became. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the sense that she wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was nearby, hidden in the shadows, watching her every move. She glanced toward the hallway, the dark space that led to the stairs, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flickered in the corner of her vision. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned her gaze back to the room, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, as it should be. Still, that fleeting glimpse of something, someone, lingering just out of sight, gnawed at her. Her pulse quickened, and she felt the familiar stirrings of unease grow stronger within her. She began to wonder if she was imagining things. Perhaps the rain had intensified the feeling of isolation, creating an atmosphere that made her feel more vulnerable than usual. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, the steady rhythm of the seconds echoing in the quiet. Tick, tick, tick. Each passing second seemed to stretch longer than it should, as though the very fabric of time had slowed down. Sarah stared at the clock, its steady ticking suddenly too loud, too intrusive in the otherwise oppressive silence. She rubbed her arms, trying to dispel the chill creeping along her skin. It felt as if the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees, even though the warmth from the heat still lingered. The air seemed to thicken around her, each breath drawing in more of the strange, heavy silence. Her eyes darted around the room again, as if expecting something to jump out at her from the shadows. But the room remained still. Too still. The lamps in the corners glowed softly, casting pools of light onto the walls, yet the shadows in between seemed deeper, as though they were waiting, watching. Sarah took a few tentative steps toward the kitchen, hoping to distract herself from the uneasy feeling that had begun to settle heavily in her chest. But as she moved through the room, it felt as though the walls were pressing in on her. The house, which had always been a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, its stillness suffocating, its silence too thick to ignore. Her footsteps on the carpet felt unnaturally loud, the soft pad of her feet against the floorboards echoing in the quiet. It was as though the house was amplifying every movement, every sound. The rain outside, once a gentle backdrop, now seemed distant, irrelevant to the sudden tension building inside the walls of her home. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, her hand resting lightly on the frame. The room felt too far away, like she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't understand. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, in the way the silence wrapped around her, in the way the shadows stretched a little too long. The unease continued to grow, slowly, until it filled every corner of the house. It was as if the very house itself had become aware, as if the walls were alive and watching her. She swallowed, the lump in her throat growing, and for the first time, she wished for the sound of the rain outside to be louder, to drown out the strange quiet that now pressed in around her. The longer Sarah stayed in the house, the more intense the sensation became. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched anymore, it was a certainty. The air seemed to pulse with it. She had the sudden, overwhelming urge to flee, to run out the door and away from the house entirely. But where could she go? The world outside felt just as silent, just as still. With every passing minute, the house grew quieter, the stillness more pronounced. Even the ticking of the clock had faded, as if it too had fallen into the silence. And yet, the feeling that she was being watched only grew stronger, the weight of unseen eyes heavy on her back, following her every movement. Sarah shook her head, trying to push the unease from her mind. It was ridiculous, she told herself. It was just the wind outside, or maybe the house settling after the rain. The old walls creaked from time to time, especially when the weather changed. That had to be it. Nothing more. She tried to focus on the familiar sounds, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the rain still pattering softly against the window, but nothing seemed to ease the discomfort. The feeling of being watched refused to leave, hovering just behind her thoughts, tugging at her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. As she stood in the living room, her eyes flicked toward the hallway. The dark space beyond the threshold seemed to stretch farther than usual, the shadows casting an eerie sense of depth that made her hesitate. She could almost imagine the hallway going on forever, leading into an endless, suffocating darkness. It was silly, she told herself again. She had lived here for years, and never once had she felt afraid of the hallway, of the stairs that led up to the second floor. But tonight, it felt different. The shadows seemed to press in, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and stepped forward, her feet soft against the carpet. Her gaze moved down the length of the hallway, taking in the familiar sights, the framed photos on the walls, the soft glow from the lamps at the end. But somehow, even these things seemed distant now, like they were part of a dream she couldn't fully grasp. As she moved toward the hallway, the darkness at the end of it felt oppressive, as though it were waiting for her to step closer. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to turn around, to retreat into the warmth and light of the living room. But she couldn't bring herself to stop. It was as though something was pulling her toward it, urging her to move deeper into the house. Her footsteps grew louder in the silence, the sound of each footfall echoing strangely in the quiet. She reached the threshold of the hallway and paused, her breath catching in her throat. The air here felt thicker, heavier, as though the very space was charged with tension. Then, as she stood there, her heart racing, she heard it. A soft creak. It was faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The sound seemed to come from upstairs, maybe from the second floor, or perhaps from the attic. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her chest. She had lived in this house for years, and the creaks of old wood were nothing new. But this sound was different. It wasn't the usual shifting of the house settling. This was deliberate, almost purposeful. She slowly exhaled, trying to convince herself that it was nothing, just the house being, well, the house. The old stairs groaned and shifted all the time. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. That creak didn't feel like the house settling. It felt like something, or someone, moving upstairs. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She turned toward the staircase, the dark steps leading up to the second floor like an invitation to something unknown. For a moment, she couldn't move, as if the house itself had wrapped her in its stillness, freezing her in place. The rain continued outside, its soft tapping against the windows almost muffled by the weight of the silence inside. Sarah stood there, in the doorway of the hallway, staring up at the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She could almost hear her own breath in the stillness, each inhale and exhale too loud in her ears. She knew it was ridiculous, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the house. It wasn't just the sense of being watched. No, this was something more. It felt like something was moving, watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge it. The thought of going upstairs, of moving closer to whatever was waiting there, felt unbearable. But what else could she do? The house was silent now, save for the faint sound of the rain and the distant creaking. She couldn't tell if the sound had stopped or if it was still there, lingering just outside her perception, waiting for her to turn her back. She swallowed hard, trying to calm herself. It was just her imagination, she told herself. Just the old house settling after the storm. And yet, as she took a step forward, the floor beneath her seemed to groan, a low, mournful sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. She glanced back at the living room, as if searching for some sign of normalcy, something to remind her that everything was fine. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch even further now, as if they were reaching out, pulling at her. The darkness at the top of the stairs felt like an invitation, and a warning all at once. The creak from upstairs came again, this time louder, more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. Something was moving upstairs. The thought raced through Sarah's mind, and her pulse quickened. She had to do something. She had to check. But as her eyes flicked back toward the stairs, she felt paralyzed. The idea of moving toward that noise, of confronting whatever it was, filled her with a deep, primal fear. She stood there in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, her feet frozen to the spot, her mind racing. The air around her felt thick with tension, the silence pressing in so heavily that it was almost suffocating. The only sound was the creaking from upstairs, growing louder and more insistent, as if something, or someone, was slowly moving across the floor above her. And then, without warning, there was a soft, almost imperceptible footstep. It was barely a sound, but it was enough to make Sarah's blood run cold. She hadn't imagined it. It was there. Someone, or something, was upstairs, moving around, as if waiting for her to take the next step. Frozen in place, Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Her mind raced, but her body refused to move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the staircase, as if doing so would make whatever was upstairs come closer. She held her breath, straining her ears, willing herself to hear something else, anything that could explain the sound. But all she could hear was the thick silence that surrounded her. The kind of silence that felt suffocating, as though the air itself had thickened. The usual sounds of the house, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, had faded, leaving nothing but a heavy, waiting quiet. Her pulse echoed in her ears, a dull drumbeat that seemed to grow louder the longer she stood there. The house had never felt this empty of sound, as if the very walls were holding their breath along with her. She swallowed, trying to steady herself, but her throat felt tight, like the air was too thick to breathe. She took a step back, instinctively retreating from the staircase. Her eyes, however, were still fixed on the shadowy space at the top of the stairs. The dark stairs loomed before her, each one stretching into a shadow that felt deeper than usual. The sensation of something hidden, waiting, had only intensified, and with each passing second, the fear in her chest grew. And that's when she heard it again. A soft thump, almost like a muffled footstep. This time, it was louder. Closer. So close, in fact, that she was sure it came from the very top of the stairs. It was a dull, almost imperceptible sound, but it was unmistakable. Her blood ran cold as the sound vibrated in the stillness, echoing through the quiet air. It wasn't just a house settling. This was something different. Something intentional. The noise had purpose behind it, a deliberate weight, as though someone, was moving around up there, just out of sight. Her breath caught in her throat. She strained her ears, waiting for another sound, anything to confirm what she had just heard. But the silence that followed felt even more oppressive. It hung in the air, thick and expectant, like the house itself was holding its breath with her. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively took another step back, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. But her feet felt heavy, as if the floor itself were resisting her movement. The familiar warmth of the house, which had always been a source of comfort, now seemed to close in on her, making her feel trapped, as though there was no safe place left. The house felt like it was closing in, the space narrowing, the walls pressing in on her. And yet, she couldn't look away from the stairs. Her eyes were locked onto the shadows at the top, as though they were pulling her in, holding her captive. The second thump, closer than the first, had shaken her to her core. But it wasn't just the sound itself that terrified her. It was the realization that whatever was making those sounds was closer than it should have been. And there was no denying it now. The sound hadn't come from the walls, or the settling of the house, it came from upstairs. Another breath caught in her chest as the air seemed to grow colder. She had to move, but her feet wouldn't obey. She felt rooted to the spot, the fear coursing through her veins, turning her limbs to stone. Her eyes never left the staircase, the dark expanse at the top, where the thumping had come from. The silence that followed felt too loud now. Too complete. Like the world had stopped spinning, like the very air had frozen in place, and everything was waiting for her to do something. Waiting for her to face what was coming. And then, the sound came again. A soft, deliberate thump, this time unmistakably closer than before. It felt like the sound was coming from just behind the door to the second floor. The hairs on Sarah's neck stood on end as she realized that whatever was upstairs was moving toward the stairs. Slowly. Methodically. Her heart pounded in her chest as a wave of dread swept over her, washing over every inch of her body. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee, to get as far away from this house as possible. But her feet remained frozen to the floor, unwilling to move. The thumping stopped for a brief moment, but the tension in the air remained, thick and palpable. It was like a waiting game now, each second stretching longer than the last, as if the house were holding its breath just like she was. And then, just as suddenly as the thumping had started, it came again. Louder this time. Closer. It sounded almost like footsteps, the distinct sound of weight shifting on the floor above, the soft scraping of a shoe against wood. But there was something off about it. It wasn't natural. It didn't feel like any ordinary movement. Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. She had never felt so utterly vulnerable in her own home before. The feeling of being watched, of being stalked, was overwhelming. And yet, she couldn't look away from the stairs. Her gaze was fixed there, as if the shadows at the top were drawing her in, holding her captive. The thumping continued, steady and relentless, each step bringing whatever was upstairs closer to her, closer to the top of the stairs. She felt the weight of each footfall in her chest, a physical presence she could almost feel in the room. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, closing in, making every breath more difficult to take. Every instinct in her screamed at her to run, to flee, to escape. But something held her in place, something beyond fear, something ancient and primal, like the very house was preventing her from moving. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding with each other in a frantic whirlwind. She couldn't think clearly. The pounding